My name is Kim Snell-Zarcone. I am with Penn, which is an environmental advocacy organization. We're a statewide organization, but I work out of the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania office, and I am a senior agricultural policy analyst, formerly with the litigation team at Penn, but now I focus all on agricultural policy and water quality issues. And John is with us here.
Thanks. My name's John Winsten, and I'm an agricultural and environmental economist for Winrock International, which is a fairly large nonprofit organization headquartered in Little Rock, Arkansas, started by Winthrop Rockefeller. I am based in the Burlington, Vermont area, and I was for 9 years a resident of central Pennsylvania up until about 2005, so I'm really glad to be back here.
And I'm Kelly O'Neill with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, based in Harrisburg. We're a regional water quality organization. My work is focused on cleaning up Pennsylvania's rivers and streams, primarily focusing on the ones that drain toward the Chesapeake Bay, but a lot of the policies and programs we work on have an impact on all of Pennsylvania. I grew up on a farm in northeastern Pennsylvania in Wayne County and have spent some time working in Honduras and in Nebraska also. So it's good to be back in Pennsylvania. Well, I wanted to start out with a success story. This is Lititz Run in Lancaster County, which this is how it looked about 20 years ago. The stream had a lot of pollution from nutrients and sediment. There really wasn't any wildlife in it, not many bugs, not many fish. It doesn't look like a place. It got very hot in the summertime. Not a very hospitable environment for critters such as fish and ducks and turtles. After a lot of work by the local Watershed Association, the Lititz Run Watershed Alliance, Warwick Township, a local chapter of Trout Unlimited, and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, there was a lot of work to deal with stormwater in the boroughs and towns in the area, and also to establish riparian buffers along streams, develop and carry out conservation plans on all the farms in the watershed, and a whole host of other conservation practices. It now looks like this. You can see a very small piece of a bridge in the lower left corner that's about the only proof that it's the same stream. It's now a thriving trout fishery with much lower levels of sediment and nutrients. It's a much healthier stream now. A lot of the focus on cleaning up our rivers and streams started when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire. There was so much oil and debris that the river was actually burning. The river had caught fire many, many times before, but the fire in 1969 actually caught national attention and started to spur action toward establishing the Clean Water Act that was passed in 1972 that requires reducing pollution levels in streams to a level that will restore their health. It's not just a regulatory requirement that we clean up local streams, but it also helps the local economies as well. This is a slide taken from the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. It shows a lot of sediment pollution in the Chesapeake Bay, but what it also shows is a lot of Pennsylvania's topsoil running down to the bay. That's topsoil we need here in Pennsylvania to grow our crops, but when it gets into the bay, it chokes out the life of the grasses and the oysters and other critters there. Another problem facing local streams and also the Chesapeake Bay is nutrient pollution. This is probably the more significant problem. The problem is rooted in a regional imbalance we have here. We have a lot of people and a lot of livestock concentrated in the Mid-Atlantic. We're bringing in a lot of grains and other feedstocks for the animals, and also importing a lot of food for ourselves. Those nutrients come in, they're digested, the waste products in some cases are used, but in a lot of cases they're accumulating on our soil. What happens with that the nutrient pollution is it fuels the growth of algae. When the algae decomposes, it sucks oxygen out of the water, which means that fish and other animals can't breathe. A large portion of the Chesapeake Bay and some of the rivers that feed into it are literally dead zones where nothing can live. We've had about 30 years of agreements, starting in 1983, to clean up our waters. It started in 1983 when the governors of Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New York, plus the Washington, D.C. mayor and the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, agreed to form the Chesapeake Bay Program, a voluntary program to cooperatively restore the Chesapeake Bay's health. They started a coordinated effort, and the goal was to reduce pollution to the Chesapeake Bay by 40% by the year 2000. That didn't work. So then they reinvigorated their efforts and decided that by 2010, we'd have healthy waters, so that we wouldn't be required by the EPA and the Clean Water Act to have what's called a total maximum daily load. In 2010, it was clear we weren't going to get there, and the EPA would be required to develop this pollution limit, or the total maximum daily load. That limit it's a scientifically calculated limit based on the best estimates available of what the pollution levels the water can handle and still be healthy. It's not to restore the bay to the pristine waters that were here before European settlement. To compare it to human health, it would be like wanting a healthy person with maybe a few extra pounds, not necessarily a marathon runner at the peak of his or her ability, but also not an obese person on the verge of a stroke. Kind of a healthy person, a healthy watershed. As a result of the TMDL, or the pollution limit, we also have a watershed implementation plan. The TMDL is just a number of what the pollution load can be, but it's not actually going to achieve anything unless we have specific plans and goals and how we're going to get there. We can't just rely on miracles and hope that at some point it happens. Pennsylvania submitted to the EPA the phase 1 of its watershed implementation plan in December 2010, and then a draft update that had more local strategies in last December. The EPA has not yet approved it. It's very vague. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that. So how have we been doing? This table shows where we were in 1985 at about 124 million pounds of nitrogen, almost 6 million pounds of phosphorus, and almost million pounds of sediment. We've made some significant progress, cut those loads to 112, 4.86, and 2,500 million tons. But the 2025 goal under the TMDL is significantly lower. So we've made 27% of the progress on nitrogen and almost half on phosphorus and sediment. We've made some significant progress, but we've got a lot more to go. This chart is just for Pennsylvania. This shows throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed an estimate of where the nitrogen pollution is coming from. About half comes from agriculture, a bit from urban and suburban runoff, some more from wastewater and combined sewer overflow, a little bit from septic systems, although that's very hard to measure. The forest segment, the block at the top, mostly accounts for atmospheric deposition. Nitrous oxides that get into the air from car exhaust, coal energy generation, and other forms of pollution. A lot of that comes back down to the earth and in rain and ends up in our rivers and streams. Similar for phosphorus and sediment. So what's in this watershed implementation plan? Our wastewater treatment plants contribute about 12% of Pennsylvania's nitrogen load. They've already been doing a lot of work to make significant upgrades. A lot of these upgrades have been very expensive. About 93 wastewater treatment plants are already meeting revised, more stringent permit requirements, and another 85 will in the next few years. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation has worked hard to get some bond and other funding to help pay for these. The watershed implementation plan is quite weak on stormwater. We have runoff from fertilizers, sediment, lawn care chemicals, and anything else that falls on urban lawns, parking lots, sidewalks, ends up in our rivers and streams. Part of the problem is that we have antiquated stormwater systems, and the investment to improve them would be significant. And the state hasn't really offered any specific plans to address them. And the state watershed implementation plan doesn't acknowledge that we may also have increased sedimentation as a result of a lot of the activity around Marcellus Shale. On agriculture, the watershed implementation plan focuses on making sure that every farm in Pennsylvania has and is carrying out an erosion and sediment control plan and a manure management plan. These requirements have actually existed since the 70s, although many folks didn't know about them because there wasn't much activity around them. But they've also been upgraded in the past few years. For erosion and sediment control, the plans now must meet the soil loss tolerance of T across the rotation. They have to minimize erosion and sedimentation from animal heavy use areas, concentration areas such as feedlots, loafing areas, barnyards. So this farm, this photo was taken in Lancaster County by the Conservation District, probably would not meet muster. You see animal concentrations around that stream, a lot of erosion right there, a lot of erosion around the farmstead. We also have a revised manure management manual. There was a manual that was established in the 70s. How many of you knew about that? Okay, a few of you. If I talked to farmers at other events, most did not know. There was no outreach and education about it, and if farmers were looking at the manual and trying to figure out whether or not they were doing a good enough job, it wasn't at all clear. There was a lot of, it's a good idea to do this. Here's some information about nitrogen cycling. It was really hard to follow. Every farm in Pennsylvania that uses or generates manure needs to have a manure management plan. This is very different from the nutrient management plan that is required of concentrated animal operations and larger concentrated animal feeding operations. It's a plan that the farmer develops on the farm. You can use this manual, and I have copies here. The plan only needs to be kept on the farm. You can go to your conservation district for help if you would like, but you don't need to have it approved or you don't need to file it with anybody. It's not a public document. It just needs to be kept up to date and on the farm in case somebody from DEP comes, or if there's a manure spill in a stream, somebody's trying to determine where it came from. If you can say, no, this is how I've been managing my manure, you're going to be okay.
One point that I think is not made well ever is that what is now very important to both DEP and EPA is implementation of these plans. It's no longer acceptable to have your manure management plan or your nutrient management plan be something that you spend a lot of money if it's a nutrient management plan, or maybe a lot of time if it's a manure management plan, and then stick on a shelf. It's something that you actually have to have the documentation to prove that you're implementing it. And I want to make sure that you guys understand that as well.
This chart shows a comparison of what is required for concentrated animal operations and CAFOs and what some of the options are for the manure management manual. You can go the route of having a full nutrient management plan developed by a certified planner. That's on the far right. It's a much more complex plan. It's often expensive to get, but that would also give you the most flexibility in terms of application rates and timing. That would also require manure tests and soil tests. You can apply manure without that using a basic manure management plan. Because manure usually has a much higher phosphorus to nitrogen ratio than crops need, if you're applying manure at the nitrogen rate, at the rate crops would need for their nitrogen, you're going to be over-applying phosphorus. So you have some options. You can get a phosphorus test on your soil, and if it is less than 200 parts per million, you can apply at the nitrogen rate. If you don't want to get a phosphorus test, or if your soil test is very high, you would be applying at rates for the phosphorus crop uptake. And there are estimates. You can use the back of this manual based on the type of crop you're using and the kind of manure you have to generate the rates. Because I'm running short on time, I'm not going to go through the calculations. The manure management manual also requires maps. They can either be hand-drawn or using the maps you would get when you're developing an erosion and sediment control plan. The PA One-Stop program also has a program that helps you generate a map on the farm. It needs to show any environmentally sensitive areas such as streams, wells, and ponds, and also any roads or property lines as well. You can apply manure within 100 feet of you cannot apply manure with 100 feet of a stream or water body unless you have a soil test with less than 200 parts per million phosphorus, no-till practices, and cover crops or residue from the previous crop. Then you can apply within 50 feet or within 35 feet if you have a permanent vegetated buffer. And no mechanical...
When you say then you can apply within 50 feet, then the setback becomes 50 feet?
Right. Or 35 feet if you have a buffer. And within 100 feet of an existing sinkhole, you cannot apply manure. The Manure Management Manual also addresses pasture management. There are two options for pasture management. One is a grazing plan that meets NRCS standards for prescribed grazing, or generally making sure that you have dense vegetation throughout the pasture, no bare spots, and that throughout the growing season it maintains an average of at least 3 inches. So something like this and not this. This farm would have two options, either addressing the pasture and making sure that it is maintaining dense vegetation, or treating it as an animal concentration area or a barnyard. They need to make sure that any of the manure in that animal concentration area isn't draining into a stream, and that the manure is carefully managed, and that it doesn't only have to be a pasture with a stream, but it could also be areas where animals congregate, around watering tanks, feeding areas. The Manure Management Manual also addresses winter application, and that is any time between December 15th through February 28th, or when the ground is frozen, or any time the ground is snow-covered or saturated. And then there are wider setbacks, always 100 feet, limits on the amount you can apply per acre. It's 5,000 gallons of liquid manure, or 20 tons per acre of dry non-poultry manure, or 3 tons of poultry manure. And there also needs to be at least 25% cover, whether it's residue from the previous crop or a cover crop, and no more than 15% slope. Storages are one option, liquid or solid, or manure stockpiling areas. If they're near the farmstead and where you're piling all your manure, they need to be on an improved stacking pad. Another option could be temporary or infield stacking. These need to be at least 100 feet from a stream, managed so that rainwater can be diverted around it if possible, but not in a concentrated flow area. They need to be the manure needs to be solid enough so that it can be stacked, and it also needs to be stacked no more in one area than can be applied in the field surrounding it. So that's it from me. I'll turn it now over to Kim.
Again, my name is Kim Snell-Zarcone. I'm with Penn Future, and I want to talk to you about nutrient trading and Chesapeake Bay. Before I go on, not everybody was here, did everybody get one of these? Anybody didn't that would like one? This is, we call it the Agriculture and Law Handbook, and it is hot off the presses. Let me pass those around. If we run out, I have more. Hot off the presses. It's Penn Future's handbook to ag and law policy, and it goes through all of the programs that regulate agriculture from an environmental perspective. And some of the programs that Kelly covered are also addressed in there. So like I said, I'm going to talk about nutrient trading, and just to get an idea of kind of who the audience is. I recognize some of your faces, but who are producers? Are any of the producers actively participating in the credit trading program? No, okay. Do we have any sewage treatment plant or publicly owned treatment plant people? Okay. Policy, watershed, organization, interests? The rest of you must be eaters then. I too love being here as an eater. So a little bit of background on the program. The nutrient trading program was started by DEP, the state agency on environmental policy, in 2006, and in October 2010, largely because of the work of Matt Royer when he was with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, DEP incorporated that policy into regulations. So the nutrient credit trading policy is now within regulation and has some legal obligations that go with it. As Kelly kind of alluded to, the link between the trading system and sewage treatment plants. And what happened was early on in the analysis of bay issues and bay impacts, it became clear that publicly owned sewage treatment plants were going to be a large factor in the cleanup of the bay because of the number of them and the quantity of nutrients that they discharge to local waters and ultimately to the bay. And then the link that made them attractive kind of targets to the state regulators and the federal regulators was that they have a permit that is issued by the state and kind of overseen by the federal government that's like the hook for how they could regulate them. And that hook is, the program's called the NPDES program. It stands for National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. So it's a fancy name for how much stuff you can discharge through a pipe into the air or into the water. The one problem that kind of became clear as there was a focus on sewage treatment plants related to the bay cleanup was that any technology-based solutions for sewage treatment plants were going to be really expensive for communities that supported those treatment plants. Very expensive to do bricks and mortar type of upgrades to sewage treatment plants. So nutrient trading became an interesting option to regulators because you could have reductions at a farming operation or some other type of industrial facility, and then people who needed to reduce their discharges of nutrients could then buy credits, if you will, from those people who were doing better than they had to be doing. And Pennsylvania, why this topic is kind of relevant to clean water in Pennsylvania now is because of the TMDL issued by EPA, and in reaction to the TMDL, Pennsylvania had to submit a watershed implementation plan, which Kelly kind of talked about. And Pennsylvania, in our watershed implementation plan, relies really heavily on the nutrient trading system to reach their nutrient reductions that we need for our bay cleanup plan. So does anybody have real familiarity with nutrient trading, or are we all, you do? What do you do?
I I work for a conservation district on an ag technician.
Excellent. Josh is our man when we have questions then. We're going to test you and call your boss. No, just kidding. So how does the program work? Josh, obviously, he might have some familiarity with it, especially if you're in the northern tier of the country, of the state. But for the rest of you, I'll give you a little primer on kind of how the system works. And as I said, it allows point sources who are anybody with a pipe that discharges to purchase credits, basically permissions that from people who've done better, to permission to use their doing better against their permit requirements. So they can purchase, you can have it between point sources, which is two people with a pipe. Person with a pipe can buy credits from someone else who has a pipe to a stream. Or you can have people who purchase point sources from non-point source discharges, which is a farming operation, kind of diffuse types of discharges, which are ag operations are considered non-point sources. Most trades in Pennsylvania are between point sources buying credits from non-point sources. So someone with a pipe sewage treatment plant buying credits from an ag operation. The real interesting aspect of this and why it's good for the ag community, and probably why it's being talked about here at Pasa, is because it is a really great way to infuse investment dollars into farming operations from something other than grants from the government. So private or corporate investment, if you want to say, into farming operations. So money that didn't otherwise exist flowing to farming operations. And the basics of the program, and this I'm mostly going to focus on the basics of the program from an ag perspective since we're here at Pasa. So the general trading principles are that you can only trade credits of like kind, nitrogen for nitrogen, phosphorus for phosphorus. And the unit that credits are traded in is pounds of the pollutant per year. And the trades are currently limited to the watershed, the large watershed, Susquehanna. So if you're in the Susquehanna and you want to buy credits, you've got to buy from someone in the Susquehanna. If you're in the unfortunate part of Pennsylvania, the Potomac, you've got to find someone in that little area to trade with. People who generate credits, we call credit generators, they have basic baseline requirements that they have to meet. If you're a farming operation, basically Pennsylvania's baseline requirements are all meet your regulatory obligations under the Clean Streams Law. If you are a CAO, you've got to meet the requirements of the Nutrient Management Program. If you're an other formerly non-regulated farm, you've now got to meet the requirements of the Manure Management Manual. And as Kelly was talking about, that apply to everybody, the erosion and sedimentation requirements of Chapter 102 is the regulatory lingo that we use. So those are your baseline requirements to even be able to come into the program as a farming operation. Basic, meeting your minimum regulatory requirements. Then there's also a threshold requirement in Pennsylvania, and you have to choose one of three options as your threshold requirement. And most farming operations should have absolutely no problem if they're meeting their regulatory requirements, meeting the threshold requirements. There's a manure application setback option, a 35-foot vegetated buffer option, and then a 20% reduction in the farm nutrients that you're currently applying, and that's a 20% reduction. The one problem with the threshold requirements is that two of the three options are regulatory requirements. So nobody ever does the third option, which is from an environmental perspective maybe the best option, which is the 20% nutrient reduction, because the farms have this other regulatory requirement of a manure setback or a buffer. So nobody ever gets to the really good environmental one, which is the reduction of nutrients. The next step in the process, once you've said, I'm going to do this, and you go forward with enthusiasm, is you walk into DEP or the Conservation District and you say, Josh, I'm ready. What do I have to do now? The next step in the process is getting your credits or your plan for your project approved by DEP and them saying you will get this many credits. That's called certification. So the certification process is almost like a mass balance equation. They look at what you were doing before the practice was installed, what you were doing after the practice was installed, and what's the difference in your discharges of nutrients between that, and that's how many credits you would get. Oftentimes, kind of simultaneously with the certification, you do a verification plan. So it's a formal plan that you submit to DEP for approval that some independent, I say independent, third party is supposed to come in and verify that the credits you're generating are real. Because these credits will be used by someone who has very stringent legal requirements that they must meet, so they've got to make sure that what you're doing, you're actually doing to get the credits and the money for them. DEP requires there to be a binding contract between the buyers and sellers of credits, and they often review those contracts. They don't have any say in how they're negotiated, but they want to see them and make sure that the things they're concerned about are covered. The last step is registration of the credits with DEP. So once a buyer and seller of credits have found each other, they go to DEP. DEP assigns them a registration number for those credits, and that's the way that DEP tracks those credits and who's using them. And that number will be used on discharge monitoring reports. We call those DMRs. So that number of how those credits are identified is put on DMRs. So one kind of interesting concept is, how do buyers and sellers find each other? Oftentimes, they are geographically connected through people like the conservation district employees. A farmer will be talking to them, and then you guys talk to the planners for the counties or the townships, and you say, hey, this guy over here is doing something really good, talk to him. So they're geographically connected. And then there's something called an aggregator, which is a private or public entity that kind of pools people who are generating credits together, and then they're just well known, so they sell those. There's currently two main aggregators, I'd say. One is Red Barn Trading, which is a shoot off of Peter Hughes' Red Barn consulting group. And then the other is Penn, which is this kind of strange public government entity that invests in clean water projects and whatnot, and they're helping with kind of running this market for nutrient credits. So where is this program now? I looked at the page for the credit trading program with DEP, and as from 2006, which was when the program was started, to the end of February, which is 2 days ago. There was 105 certified proposals, which, sounds really robust and like, wow, 105. But we actually have a really small trading program. But we've got the best start of our Bay friends. It was interesting to me that a few of the proposals that had come in the past, I'd say 2 or 3 months, were actually sewage treatment plants who had upgraded beyond, expecting in the next 10 to 15 years, whatever their life expectancy is for upgrades. They've overbuilt, expecting expansion and tap-ins and things like that. So they can currently, until they reach their capacity for their permit limits, they can sell the credits that they have. They actually have capacity. So I thought that was interesting, because typically to now we've seen the people that were coming in for credits were agricultural operations. Of those 105 that have been certified projects, approximately half of those certifications have expired, because they were ones that were really early in the program, and they had maybe like 3-year limits or something like that on them. About a third of the proposals were for manure transport out of the watershed, which my organization views as a non-sustainable type of practice and one that shouldn't be in the program. So obviously that's a problem from my perspective. And over a third of the practices were contingent on the sale of the credits. So it's not improvements that have been done. They won't be done until somebody buys those credits. So you have to keep that kind of in mind, or take it with a grain of salt when you hear 105 proposals. It's not necessarily 105 improvements. So you might be thinking in your head, especially if you're a farmer, how much are they getting for these credits? You know, what do you think, how many pounds per acre and how many acres do I have? And the original prices for both nitrogen and phosphorus credits were going for about $8 to $15 a pound. And now the prices are in the range of $2 to $5 a pound because there's just economics in play, laws of supply and demand, and there is way more supply than is being demanded. So the price has really come down.
Is that for nitrogen and phosphorus?
Yeah, they're both in the range of $2 to $5, and nitrogen is lower than phosphorus. So regional trading is seen as a natural progression from everybody in all the Bay States having their own kind of individual programs. And there's some problems and obstacles to regional trading. One is that while we in Pennsylvania, and I don't say we as Penn Future endorsing the current program, we meaning DEP and others that run the program, they're excited about their own program and think they have a great program set up. But other states are unwilling to accept credits from Pennsylvania as the system is currently set up. So currently, Pennsylvania credits are good in Pennsylvania, but they're not good in Maryland or Virginia or West Virginia. And our Maryland friends have been very vocal about the inadequacies of Pennsylvania's trading program, particularly our baseline requirements. Because of kind of the perfect storm that was brewing around credit trading, Penn Future, which is the organization I work for, decided we really needed to engage more in the credit trading arena and really evaluate our state program and just make our own determination of the adequacies and inadequacies in the program. And those of you that were the early birds here, you definitely got the worm because I brought 5 copies of our report, which looks something like this. And the ones that I handed out don't have all the appendices on them, but that full report is available on our website, and I just didn't want to print 50 copies and have 5 people show up and then have lots of paper wasted. So please feel free to find our full report on our website. And the report evaluated 3 things. There's 3 things we're really interested in taking a look at. The first was the technical aspects and the regulatory framework of the Pennsylvania system. So just kind of what is the soundness of Pennsylvania's trading system? Is there any factors we're missing we should be looking at and aren't? Then one was to review the trades to date that have happened in Pennsylvania. And then the most important and what's kind of been the most telling is the evaluation of a Pennsylvania trade in the other Bay states that have trading programs and kind of what they looked like. I don't have time to step through all of our actual analysis of the program, which is what I think is most interesting. But ultimately, the comparisons of the trade in Pennsylvania versus the other states, Pennsylvania's gives many more credits than the other states do for similar practices. And obviously that's a problem either internally or with the other states. Quick benefits of a trading program is that it's a lower cost for ratepayers than bricks and mortar upgrades potentially in the short term. And it's certainly from an agricultural perspective, it's an infusion of money into agricultural operations that wouldn't otherwise have happened. If we have time at the end to circle back around, I can certainly discuss the problems we found with the Pennsylvania trading program. But generally, Pennsylvania's trading program has a lot of flexibility in it, which is great because all sorts of different projects can be included. But that flexibility lends itself very well to manipulation and people kind of learning how to work the system and taking advantage of it. Our conclusions were that Pennsylvania's program is short on baseline requirements, overly generous on nutrient credit generation, and short on verification assurances, but that ultimately the system isn't beyond repair, so we kind of shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. With solid improvements, we could have a really strong regional trading program as well as a state trading program. And now we have John.
Okay. So what I wanted to talk about is, an alternative policy approach for meeting water quality goals. And this is a little bit unusual in the sense that the focus is going to be what we're calling pay-for-performance conservation or performance-based incentives. And currently there aren't any federal or state programs that are really doing this. But it's an idea that we've been working on for a number of years with folks in watersheds around the country to generate ideas for how this could be done and for pilot testing those ideas in some places. And I'm glad to be here to throw this idea out onto the floor for you guys because I think it's something that does play into, has a potential role to play in meeting TMDL requirements, in enhancing water quality credit trading programs, and maybe even playing a role in agricultural certainty. From my perspective, really what's needed in the big picture are conservation programs for agriculture that have clear and appropriate pollution reduction goals. So at the moment, our major programs like EQIP, administered through USDA and NRCS, its goals are really about getting practices on the ground and not really focused on outcomes. And we need programs that get producers interested and motivated to participate in them. And our current approach of cost-sharing BMPs appeals to some producers. It doesn't really do much to motivate other producers. And what we really need are programs that provide flexibility and incentive for producers to choose actions that really maximize the bang for the buck, meaning give us the best, most reductions for each dollar spent. And in our current programs, we really have no idea what the bang for the buck is. We know what the dollar value is, but we don't really know what we're getting for it. So the background on this is that agriculture continues to be the primary source of water quality impairments across the country. Of course, it's not the only one, but in rural places, it tends to be the primary source. And so our current conservation programs spend close to $5 billion per year across the U.S. They're not focused on environmental outcomes. They're really focused on practices put on the ground. And they've really not reduced the level of impairments in many places. And so people are asking the question, well, what are we getting for this money we're spending, and how can we do things differently, because we need to make progress on these water quality issues. And importantly, our current programs don't motivate producers or incentivize them to take the most cost-effective actions they can take for their specific fields. So to try to describe pay-for-performance conservation, it's an approach that rewards producers for achieving specific environmental performance targets. Farmers choose how to achieve those targets, and it incentivizes farmers to choose the most cost-effective actions. And in this way, it provides opportunities for additional farm income, being that if a producer can achieve the target for a cost less than the amount of the incentive they get, then there's extra money in their pocket. So it's really utilizing the profit motive to get producers to allocate resources and make the most cost-effective decisions they can. So the justification behind it really is that, although Kim was just talking about water quality credit trading, and that's springing up in many other places, aside from that, there really is no market for ag pollution control. And water quality credit trading is really in its infancy. And so most producers really don't have a price to line up against like they do for the price of corn or the price of milk to make their decisions of how they allocate resources. So the current incentives, the cost share dollars, are tied to specific practices. Okay? And the current practices that can be cost shared are really a subset of all of the actions that are possible. For the EQIP program, they need to be things in the field office technical guide, and they need to be followed exactly as they're listed in there. The effectiveness of those practices varies greatly, not just from one kind of practice like cover cropping to riparian buffers, but even within a given kind of practice, there's huge variation. And it depends on a lot of things. And so when we do accounting, and I assume that even in the statistics that you guys have shared, in the Bay model, there's a constant coefficient that's attached to riparian buffers. Well, I'm not sure that that's really a robust way to go because of this huge variation. So with this pay-for-performance approach, a well-designed incentive, like a performance-based incentive offered from policy, can serve as a price for pollution control. So the producer can say, okay, I'll get that much if I can produce this level of reduction or this level of water quality. Then they can start to think about, in a business planning framework, what's it going to cost me to get there? And start to make informed business decisions on their farm regarding water quality. So environmental performance becomes incorporated into farm business planning. And so you have to forgive me, but I'm an economist, and so this is really where we want to get to. We want producers, we don't want to be telling them, you should do this practice, and then that'll solve our problems. We really want them to be thinking about what's the best solution that they can do on their specific farm and fields. So the potential benefits are improved environmental quality, flexibility, induced innovation, and all those things, while they sound great, are really a way just to get to lower cost solutions, which I think is very important in this, and enhancing farm income. Again, if the producer has costs for achieving the target that are less than the income that they get for doing it. The challenges and constraints are not trivial, of course, and most of you are probably thinking right away, well, how are you going to measure performance? And, non-point source pollution is a very difficult issue. It's not practical to measure it at the edge of every field. So then what do we do? And, our thinking has been that there are ways to quantify it rather than just attach a single constant coefficient, to look at the field and use maybe a simple computer simulation model or some other way of getting field-specific estimates of performance. As you can tell, it's also an information-intensive approach. The producer needs to have a lot of information to figure out what the best approach would be. The administering agency needs information on how to set the price for the incentive and how to verify and these kinds of things. Designing the incentives correctly so you don't have perverse outcomes is not trivial. And the whole thing is really a shifting of gears. We've been focused on practice-based approaches for decades, for good reason. So why pay for performance conservation? Now, this graph, in my mind, sums it up, so I'll try to explain it fairly concisely, if I can. This graph is from some work that we did in Vermont. In Vermont and in Iowa, we pilot tested through a conservation innovation grant this performance-based incentive approach. In Vermont, we were working on the phosphorus issue into Lake Champlain. And so what this graph shows, each of those bars represents an actual reduction strategy on an actual farm. So this is across a set of about 12 farms, and each farm might have looked at 2, 3, or 4, or maybe up to 6 different actions they could take on the farm. We ran those through the Vermont Phosphorus Index, which is a simple spreadsheet-based model to estimate field-specific risk of phosphorus loss. But underneath there, it actually has numbers that do estimate the pounds per acre per year of phosphorus loss that you would get. And so it takes into account, the phosphorus index takes into account things like, there's major categories, sources of phosphorus. So the amount that's in the soil, the amount that's added in manure, the amount that's added in fertilizer, and the transport of phosphorus, the soil type, the slope of the field, the proximity to surface water, the existence or width of a vegetative buffer, things like that. And so it uses science in sort of a simple way. And most states have a phosphorus index. Pennsylvania has one.
Similar to Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
The factors he was talking about, their source and transport, very similar.
And I'm just using this as an example. I'm not here to say that the phosphorus index is the way that performance should be quantified, but that's what we decided as a group with farmers and agency folks and researchers in Vermont. And so then we started to work with farmers on this, and each one of those columns, each one of those bars in the graph represents the cost per pound of phosphorus loss reduction from where the farm was for different actions. And we color-coded them so that you could see the type of, the category that the action falls in. So the yellows are cover crops. And the darker red is either manure or fertilizer management action. And so the things that I would like to say about this graph are that you can see how we truncated the graph at $100 per pound. The reason we did that is so you could see more of the texture, because if we showed it all the way up, this right-hand most yellow bar went up to $842. So that was a cover cropping strategy on a farm where the farmer said, yeah, I'll put cover crops on these 2 fields of mine. And I don't know why it was decided between our project and the farmer that they would choose those 2 fields, but when we went back and looked at it, those fields were relatively flat, didn't have high soil phosphorus levels, not particularly close to surface water, and yet you still have the cost per acre of putting in a winter cover crop. So it was not very cost effective at all in that situation. You can see there are cover crop strategies that are much more cost effective. And then the left-handmost bar that's down below the 0 line in the negative was a farm that was, these are all dairy farms. And this farm was putting out 200 pounds of a 2010-10 fertilizer on all of their cornfields, regardless of what the soil phosphorus was. And so together we came up with an idea that for the fields that had high soil phosphorus, they could cut that 200 pounds down to 50 pounds and then make up the nitrogen needs with urea, which has no phosphorus in it. And that change saved the farm a little bit of money. Probably not enough money to get them to really want to go and seek it out. But then when you add the incentive payment, and this black horizontal line at $25 represents the payment that we decided to offer the farms per pound of phosphorus loss reduction in our pilot testing project. And 25 is not a magical number. We basically just looked at this graph and said, we want something that we know there'll be some actions that would be cost effective. And anything where the bar is not up to the black line means, in theory, from our calculations, the producer would end up with more if they did that action and received the incentive payment. So, the gist of this graph, and the people I work with make fun of me for getting so excited about a graph, and justifiably so, but there's so much variation, not only across the different kinds of practices you could do, but within a certain practice, that we really need to be getting specific in terms of field-specific performance and rewarding producers for that. So some of the key questions. How do we quantify environmental performance? There's the issue of trying to measure it versus modeling it. And on that issue, measured performance, well, it's real data and people are more comfortable with it, but it's probably not practical at the farm level. And then are there ways you could use proxy variables? Use the soil phosphorus level, things you can measure, maybe or maybe not, because as we've talked about, you could have high soil phosphorus in a field that's not sloping and not near surface water. That's not really a problem. That's not to rule out proxy variables in general, but modeled performance, the questions are, is it accurate enough? And in any given year, it probably won't be because there's huge fluctuations in weather that drive these systems. But maybe over the long term, if a model is accurate enough that it will be accurate on average over several years. Is it simple enough to use? And really importantly, from an economic standpoint, would the model allow flexibility for different kinds of scenarios to be run. I mean, any model will allow for scenario analysis, so the farmer can run different actions through and see, before they make any changes, what their performance is going to be. And to have confidence, no matter what the weather was, okay, if I did these things, that's my performance. That's a nice thing, even though that performance may not match up to reality because of weather situations. One thing that we came up with was a suggested combination of modeling farm-level performance and having that trigger a primary incentive for producers. And then in a watershed, so if we were working in a small enough watershed, we could be actually monitoring water quality at the mouth of the watershed and use that to trigger a secondary incentive payment to participating producers. And the nice thing about that is that, and I may have this on the next slide, is that it gives farmers and other people concerned with water quality in the watershed a place to focus, to look at. We want to see reductions there. We're measuring it there. And having a payment triggered from that, or not, just having that focal point even may be enough to get farmer-to-farmer discussion and peer pressure going on, saying, hey, there's this program, you should perhaps think of joining it. So it's an idea we like. We haven't really been able to implement it on this level yet because it costs money. So where do we quantify the environmental performance? We need measures that are closely related to the ultimate water quality concern and are directly influenced by farm management decisions. So where we're working in Iowa, in eastern Iowa near the Mississippi, the concern is that a lot of those nutrients, especially nitrogen, are causing the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And so if our performance measure was the size of that dead area in the Gulf of Mexico, farmers in Iowa, if we're going to reward farmers in Iowa, they're not going to do anything different because there's a huge disconnect. And so, I mean, that's an extreme example. But measuring the performance in a way that's both connected to actual outcomes and that the farmer can see that my actions are going to make a difference in that, and hopefully only my actions, seems to be important. So you can measure the performance, in the lake, in the Chesapeake Bay, in the Gulf of Mexico, but that may have some problems in getting farmers to do something differently. You can move upstream into the river, whether that's into the Susquehanna or the Mississippi or into, the little tributary. There still may be issues that farmers feel like, I could do these things, and my neighbor's not going to, and there's not going to be change in the river. And so the groups we've worked with have almost exclusively wanted to focus on measuring performance at the farm level. And as I said earlier, that really necessitates, it seems, for practicality, modeling work at the farm level. For sake of time, I've already talked about this. Model at the farm, measure at the watershed. That seems to be an approach that we think could work well. What do we pay for? Reduced losses, so reductions from a farm's baseline, or having farm be at some level of losses, some stewardship level or below? That's an open question that has to do with important for cost effectiveness, for budgets, but also for fairness. And how much do we pay? In my mind, it's not so important that it be equal to the value to society of reducing a pound of phosphorus or a pound of nitrogen or a pound of sediment, but enough to get farmers to want to do it. And where will the funding come from? This is an important question people always ask. I don't know, but we're already spending $5 billion a year on this issue, so there is money out there that could be spent differently. And we're currently working with NRCS headquarters in Washington to try to get them to pilot test this, to take it on themselves and start to play with it some. So the relevance here, as I mentioned before, for TMDLs, for ag certainty, for water quality credit trading, I think it all, getting specific performance-based measurements or quantification at the field level, I think is important for all these things. You can get more info on the stuff that we've done at this flexincentives.com website, and then my email's there and my phone. Feel free to contact me. And I'll stop there.
First speaker, there's a lot of concern about TMDLs. There's a lot of discussion about the fact they're not based on anything. It's just a bunch of computer garbage. And how do you know that this is that and this is that? How do you convince people that they're actually based on something?
Good question. He's wondering about whether or not the TMDL is actually legitimate. And it is a computer model. It's as good as a computer model can be. It's grounded in in-stream monitoring throughout the watershed, throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. There are monitors, many throughout the watershed. Pennsylvania has, I don't know, maybe 20 monitors? At least. It has been vetted through peer-reviewed scientific journals. A lot of people have been looking at it. It's far from perfect. It's the best we have. Part of the problem is that not all the data that is needed goes into it. We have the water quality data that's from the stream that's compared to the model. We have data that goes into it on practices that are funded by NRCS, by the state, because that's what is readily available to the State Department of Environmental Protection, which then forwards it to EPA. What's not included are a lot of practices that are done on farms voluntarily, like cover crops. Farmers do them because they make sense. They're not receiving, in many cases, any kind of public funding for that, so it's not tracked by any government agency, and it doesn't go into the model. That's a huge gap, and it's one it's hard to address because I may plant cover crops on my farm, and you may plant them on your farm. I might get mine started late. They might not actually grow. It's hard to know how to, if we all just send in a form to DEP and said we planted cover crops, it may go into the model, but it won't be 100% accurate. And then there are also a lot of problems in the model of things that have been established many years ago and are still tracked, but are no longer in place. For example, riparian buffers that may have been planted 20 years ago are included in our model, but maybe the trees have all died.
Or Kelly, the converse of that too is that you get full credit for a buffer in year one, but its full effectiveness isn't realized until later years. So there's also kind of the other hand of Kelly's comment.
So it's not accurate, but nothing is accurate. It's the best we have.
And it's the most scientifically reviewed model that exists.
The thing is, there's an awful lot of money and an awful lot of effort being placed on these watershed improvement plans based on this model, which is, everybody says is not accurate.
It's not accurate, but it's the best we have, and it's also backed up with testing in the streams. We don't need a model to know that we need to do better in Pennsylvania.
The comment we always have is that your efforts affect your local watershed, and there's really no harm in over-cleaning water. I mean, you're never going to over-clean the water too much. So the efforts that you do on your farm are certainly going to benefit you and your neighbors. And whether the model is flawed or not flawed, certainly you're going to be helping your community out by doing good on your farm, helping your livestock out, helping the local critters in your farm, around your farmland, and potentially economically impacting fly fishing in your area and whether people come from other places to do activities in your area. So, there are local benefits to cleaning your local waters as well. Martha, to sum up for the recording, Martha's comment was that there's always inaccuracies and fluidity to modeling, and just because we don't have perfection in the model doesn't mean we shouldn't try to clean up the waters. You had another question.
The scenario is, I was at a meeting with a bunch of farmers, and a speaker got up and tried to explain to us this TMDL, this watershed improvement plan. And we farmers are going to have to reduce our soil erosion even more. We're going to have to fence out more streams. We're going to have to plant more cover crops. We're going to have to take care of our manure and everything. And some guy said, how about these guys that are drilling for Marcellus Shale? What do they have to do different? The speaker said nothing. Is that true, and why is that?
One of the things that Kelly's organization and the question was whether Marcellus Shale impacts are included in the Watershed Implementation Plan. And Kelly's organization, my organization, both have commented on, been pretty involved in the development of the Watershed Implementation Plan, and both of our organizations have been very vocal about the impacts from drilling not being included in the plan. So I think we would both agree with you that it's very lacking, and that the state is overlooking all, and Kelly alluded to this, all the sedimentation issues that can result from clearing the land of trees and other things. So we agree, it's a big problem.
The Watershed Implementation Plan also doesn't relate to a lot of the things that we all consider some of the biggest risks, the fracking fluid and what happens to that if some of it ends up in streams or in groundwater. The Watershed Implementation Plan deals with nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. We know that there are going to be impacts throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed of the sediment. When forest or farmland is converted to drilling pads, there's erosion in the process and long-term sediment loss when that forest is no longer a healthy, thriving forest, but is something else. They do have to have some erosion and sediment control plans around the drilling pad and any other area where there's soil disturbance, but it's not perfect, and we do know that there is some sediment loss from those that isn't accounted for in the WIP. I also wanted to mention that here I have a summary of the Manure Management Manual. This is a summary of the TMDL process and what's happening in Pennsylvania. Copies of the Manure Management Manual here. Kim has a copy of her publication, Agriculture and the Law. There's also a discussion session happening next about the Manure Management Manual, and in the Executive Conference Suite. I'm not sure where that is. Josh, do you know anywhere?